History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 4, The Age of Diverging Traditions. Chapter 10, Europe, the First Revolution. Religious zeal in the 15th century more and more appeared to bypass the central apparatus of the church. Fervor manifested itself in a continuing flow of mystical writing and in new fashions in popular religion. A new obsession with the agony of Christ's passion appears in pictorial art. New devotions to saints, a craze for flagellation, outbreaks of dancing frenzy all show a heightened excitability. An outstanding example of the appeal and power of a popular preacher can be seen in Savonarola, a Dominican whose immense success made him for a time moral dictator of Florence in the 1490s. But religious fervor often escaped the formal and ecclesiastical structures. In the 14th and 15th centuries, much of the emphasis of popular religion was individual and devotional. Another impression of inadequacy of both vision and machinery within the hierarchies is also to be found in a neglect of missionary work outside Europe. All in all, the 15th century leaves a sense of withdrawal, an ebbing after a big effort which had lasted nearly 2 centuries. Yet, to leave the medieval church with that impression uppermost in our minds would be to risk a grave misunderstanding of a society made more different from our own by religion than by any other factor. Europe was still Christendom and was so even more consciously after 1453. Within its boundaries, almost the whole of life was defined by religion. All power flowed ultimately from God. The church was, for most men and women, the only recorder and authenticator of the great moments of their existence, their marriages, their children's birth and baptisms, their deaths. Many of them wholly gave themselves up to it. A much greater proportion of the population became monks and nuns than is the case today. But though they might think of withdrawal to the cloister from a hostile everyday existence, what they left behind was no secular world, such as ours, wholly distinct from and indifferent to the church. Learning, charity, administration, justice, and huge stretches of economic life all fell within the ambit of regulation of religion. Even when men attacked churchmen, they did so in the name of the standards of church the church had itself taught them, and with appeals to the knowledge of God's purposes it had given to them. Religious myth was not only the deepest spring of civilization, it was still the life of all men. It defined human purpose and did so in terms of a transcendent good. Outside the church, the community of all believers lay only paganism. The devil, conceived in a most material form, lay in wait for those who strayed from the path of grace. If there were some bishops and even popes among the errant, so much worse for them. Human frailty could not compromise the religious view of life. God's justice would be shown, and he would divide sheep from goats in the day of wrath, when all things would end. Principalities and powers. Most of us today are now used to the idea of the state. It is generally agreed that the world's surface is divided between impersonal organizations, working through officials marked out in special ways, and that such organizations provide the final public authority for any given area. Often, states are thought in some way to represent people or nations, but whether they do or not, states are the building blocks from which most of us would construct a political account of the modern world. None of this would have been intelligible to a European in 1000. 500 years later, much of it might well have been, depending on who the European was. The process by which the modern state emerged, though far from complete by 1500, is one of the markers which delimit the modern era of history. The realities had come first, before principles and ideas. From the 13th century onwards, many rulers, usually kings, were able for a variety of reasons to increase their power over those they ruled. This was often because they could keep up large armies and arm them with the most effective weapons. Iron cannons were invented in the early 14th century. Bronze followed, and in the next century, big cast iron guns became available. With their appearance, great men could no longer brave the challenges of their rulers from behind the walls of their castles. Steel crossbows, too, gave a big advantage to those who could afford them. Many rulers were, by 1500, well on the way to exercising a monopoly of the use of armed force within their realms. They were arguing more, too, about the frontiers they shared, and this expressed more than just better techniques of surveying. It marked a change in emphasis within the government, from a claim to control persons who had a particular relationship to the ruler to one to control people who lived in a certain area. Territorial was replacing personal dependence. Over such territorial agglomerations, royal power was increasingly exercised directly through officials who, like weaponry, had to be paid for. A kingship which worked through vassals known to the king, who did much of his work for him in return for his favors and who supported him in the field when he needs something that went beyond what his own estates could supply, gave way to one in which royal government was carried out by employees, paid for by taxes, more and more in cash, not kind, the raising of which was one of their most important tasks. The parchments of charters and rolls began by the 16th century to give way to the first trickles and rivulets of what was to become the flood of modern bureaucratic paper. Such a sketch hopelessly blurs this immensely important and complicated change. It was linked to every side of life, to religion and the sanctions and authority it embodied, to the economy, the resources it offered, and the social possibilities it opened or closed, to ideas and the pressure they exerted on still plastic institutions. But the upshot is not in doubt. Somehow, Europe was beginning by 1500 to organize itself differently from the Europe of Carolingians and Ottonians. Though personal and local ties were to remain for centuries, overwhelmingly the most important ones for most Europeans, society was institutionalized in a different way from that of the days when even tribal loyalties still counted. The relationship of the lord and vassal, which, with the vague claims of pope and emperor in the background, so long seemed to exhaust political thought, was beginning to give way to an idea of princely power over all the inhabitants of a domain which, in extreme assertions, such as that of Henry VIII of England, that a prince knew no external superior save God, was really quite new. Necessarily, such a change neither took place everywhere in the same way nor at the same pace. By 1800, France and England would have been, for centuries, conceivable as notions in a way that Germany and Italy were still not. Wherever it happened, the heart of this was usually the steady aggrandizement of royal families. Kings enjoyed great advantages. If they ran their affairs carefully, they had a more solid power base in their usually large and sometimes very large domains than had noblemen in their smaller estates. The kingly office had a mysterious aura about it, reflected in the solemn circumstances of coronations and anointings. Royal courts seemed to promise a more independent, less expensive justice than could be got from the local feudal lords. In the 12th century, too, a new consciousness of the need for law began to appear, and kings were in a powerful position to say what law was to run in their courts. They could therefore appeal not only to the resources of the feudal structure at whose head or somewhere near it they stood, but also to other forces outside. One of these, which was slowly revealed as of growing importance, was the sense of nationhood. This idea, which modern man takes for granted and must be careful not to antedate. No medieval state was national in our sense. Nevertheless, by 1500, the subjects of the kings of England and France could think of themselves as different from aliens who were not their fellow subjects, even if they might also regard people who lived in the next village as virtually foreigners. Even 200 years earlier, this sort of distinction was being made between those born within and those born outside the realm, and the sense of community of the native born was steadily enhanced. One symptom was the appearance of belief in national patron saints, though churches had been dedicated to him under the Anglo Saxon kings. Only in the 14th century did St. George's red cross on a white background became a kind of uniform for England soldiers when he was recognized as official protector of England. His exploit in killing the dragon had only been attributed to him in the 12th century and may be the result of mixing him up with the legendary Greek hero Perseus. Another was the writing of national histories, already foreshadowed by the Dark Age histories of the Germanic people, and the discovery of national heroes. In the 12th century, a Welshman more or less invented the mythological figure of Arthur, while an Irish chronicler of the same period built up an unhistorical myth of the High King Brian Boru and his defense of Christian Ireland against the Vikings. Above all, there was more vernacular literature. First Spanish and Italian, then French and English began to break through the barriers set about literary creativity by Latin. The ancestors of these tongues are recognizable in 12th century romances, such as the Song of Roland, which transformed a defeat of Charlemagne by Pyrenean mountaineers into the glorious stand of his rearguard against the Arabs, or the poem of Cid, the epic of a Spanish national hero. With the 14th century came Dante, Langland, and Chaucer, each of them writing in a language which we can read with little difficulty. We must not exaggerate the immediate impact. For centuries yet, family, local community, religion, or trade were still to be the focus of most men's loyalties. Such national institutions as they could have seen growing among them would have done little to break into the conservatism. In few places was it more than a matter of the king's justices and the king's tax gatherers. And even in England, the most national of late medieval states, many people might never have seen either. The rural parishes and little towns of the Middle Ages, on the other hand, were real communities and in ordinary times provided enough to think about in a way of social responsibilities. We really need another word than nationalism to suggest the occasional and fleeting glimpses of a community of the realm which might once in a while touch a medieval man, or even the irritation which might suddenly burst out in a riot against the presence of foreigners, whether workmen or merchants. Medieval anti Semitism, of course, had different roots. Yet, such hints of national feelings occasionally reveal the slow consolidation of support for new states in the Western Europe. The first to cover anything like the areas of their modern successors were England and France. A few thousand Normans had come over from France after the invasion of 1066 to Anglo Saxon England to form a new ruling class. Their leader, William the Conqueror, gave them lands but retained more for himself. The royal estates were larger than those of his Anglo Saxon predecessors. and asserted an ultimate lordship over the rest. He was to be the lord of the land, and all men held what they held, either directly or indirectly, of him. He inherited the prestige and machinery of Old English monarchy too, and this was important, for it raised him decisively above his fellow Norman warriors. The greatest of them became William's earls and barons, the lesser ones among them knights, ruling England at first from the wooden and earth castles, which they spread over the length of the land. They had conquered one of the most civilized societies in Europe, which went on under an Anglo Norman king to show unusual vigor. A few years after the conquest, English government carried out one of the most remarkable administrative acts of the Middle Ages, the compilation of the Domesday Book, a huge survey of England for royal purposes. The evidence was taken from the juries in every shire and hundred, and its minuteness deeply impressed the Anglo Saxon chronicler, who bitterly noted, "It is shameful to record, but did not seem shameful for him to do, that not an ox, cow, or pig escaped the notice of William's men." In the next century, there was rapid, even spectacular development in the judicial strength of the crown. Though minorities and weak kings from time to time led to royal concessions to the magnates, the essential integrity of the monarchy was not compromised. The constitutional history of England is for 500 years the story of the authority of the crown, its waxing and waning. This owed much to the fact that England was separated from possible enemies, except to the north by water. It was hard for foreigners to interfere in her domestic politics, and the Normans were to remain her last successful invaders. For a long time, though, the Anglo Norman kings were more than kings of an island state. They were heirs of a complex inheritance of possessions and feudal dependencies, which at its furthest stretch far into southwestern France. Like their followers, they still spoke Norman French. The loss of most of their Angevin inheritance at the beginning of the 12th century was decisive for France as well as for England. A sense of nationhood was further nurtured in each of them by their quarrels with one another. The Capetians had hung on grimly to the French crown. From the 10th century to the 14th, their kings succeeded one another in unbroken hereditary succession. They added to the domain lands which were the basis of royal power. The Capetians' land were rich too. They fell in the heartland of modern France, the cereal growing area round Paris called the Isle de France, which was for a long time the only part of the country bearing the old name of Francia, thus commemorating the fact that it was a fragment of the old kingdom of the Franks. The domains of the first Capetians were thus distinguished from the other West Carolingian territories, such as Burgundy, by 1300. Their vigorous successors had expanded Francia to include Bourges, Tours, Guizot, and Amiens. By then, the French kings had also acquired Normandy and other feudal dependencies from the kings of England. This is a reminder that in the 14th century and later, there were still great fiefs and feudal principalities in what is now France, which make it improper to think of the Capetian kingdom as a monolithic unity. Yet it was a unity of sorts, though much rested on the personal tie. During the 14th century, that unity was greatly enhanced by a long struggle with England, remembered by the misleading name of the Hundred Years' War. In fact, English and French were only sporadically at war between 1337 and 1453. Sustained warfare was difficult to keep up. It was too expensive. Formally, though, what was at stake was the maintenance by the kings of England of territorial and feudal claims on the French side of the Channel. In 1350, Edward III had quartered his arms with those of France. There were therefore always likely to be specious grounds to start fighting again, and the opportunities it offered to English noblemen for booty and ransom money made war seem a plausible investment to many of them. For England, these struggles supplied new elements to the infant mythology of nationhood, largely because of the great victories won at Crecy and Agincourt, and generated a long lived distrust of the French. The Hundred Years' War was important to the French monarchy because it did something to check feudal fragmentation and broke down somewhat the barriers between Picard and Gascon, Norman and French. In the long run, too, French national mythology benefited. Its greatest acquisition was the story and example of Joan of Arc, whose astonishing career accompanied the turning of the balance of long struggle against the English, though few Frenchmen of the day knew she existed. The two long term results of the war which mattered most were that Crecy soon led to the English conquest of Calais, and that England was the loser in the long run. Calais was to be held by the English for 200 years, and open Flanders, where a cluster of manufacturing towns was ready to absorb English wool and later cloth exports to English trade. England's ultimate defeat meant that her territorial connection with France was virtually at an end by 1500. Though in the 18th century, George III was still entitled King of France. Once more, England became almost an island. After 1453, French kings could push forward with the consolidation of their state, undisturbed by the obscure claims of the England's kings from which the wars had sprung. They could settle down to establish their sovereignty over their rebellious magnates at their leisure. In each country, war in the long run strengthened the monarchy. Processes which laid out the groundwork for a national consolidation were also to be seen at work, if sometimes haphazardly and fitfully, in Spain. By 1500, the Spanish had a mythical underpinning for a national history in the story of the Reconquest. The sense of a long drawn out war of religion with Islam gave Spanish nationhood a special shape and flavor. The Reconquest was indeed sometimes preached as a crusade. It was a cause which could unite men of very diverse background and origins. Sometimes, too, Christian kings had worked with Moorish allies, and there had been periods of peaceful coexistence when no strong sense of religious exclusiveness seemed to divide peoples living side by side in the peninsula. Yet the Reconquest was also a series of colonial wars to repossess and exploit lands conquered by the Arab armies centuries before. Under varying impulses, therefore, the frontiers of the Christian kingdoms moved slowly forward. In the mid 12th century, Toledo was again a Christian capital, with its greatest mosque pressed into service as a cathedral. And in the 13th, the Castilians overran Andalusia, and the Aragonese seized the Arab city of Valencia. In 1340, when the last great Arab offensive was defeated, success brought the threat of anarchy as the turbulent nobles of Castile strove to assert themselves. The monarchy took the burghers of the towns into alliance. The establishment of stronger personal rule followed the union of the crowns of Aragon and Castile by the marriage in 1479 of Los Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. This made easier both the final expulsion of the Moors and the eventual creation of one nation, though the two kingdoms long remained formally and legally separate. Only Portugal in the peninsula remained outside the framework of a new Spain. She clung to an independence often threatened by her powerful neighbor. Little sign of ground plans of future nations was to be found in Germany. Potentially, the claims of the Holy Roman Emperors were an important and broad base for political power. Yet, after 1300, they had lost virtually all the special respect due to their title. The last German to march to Rome and force his coronation as emperor did so in 1328, and it proved an abortive effort. A long 13th century dispute between rival emperors was one reason for this. Another was the inability of the emperors to consolidate monarchical authority in their diverse dominions. In Germany, the domains of successive imperial families were usually scattered and disunited. The imperial election was in the hands of great magnates. Once elected, emperors had no special capital city to provide a center for the nascent German nation. Political circumstances led them more and more to devolve such power as they possessed. Important cities began to exercise imperial powers within their territories. In 1356, a document traditionally accepted as a landmark in German constitutional history, though only a registration of established fact, the Golden Bull, named seven electoral princes who acquired the exercise of almost all the imperial rights in their own lands. Their jurisdiction, for example, was henceforth absolute. No appeals lay from their courts to the emperor. What persisted in this situation of attenuated imperial power was a reminiscence of the mythology, which would still prove a temptation to vigorous princes. An Austrian family, the House of Habsburg, eventually succeeded to the imperial throne. The first Habsburg to be emperor was chosen in 1273, but he remained a solitary example for a long time. The imperial greatness of the house lay ahead, for the Habsburgs were to provide emperors almost without break from the accession of Maximilian I, who became emperor in 1493, to the end of the empire in 1806. And even then, they were to survive another century as rulers of a great state. They began with an important advantage. As German princes went, they were rich, but major resources only became available to them after a marriage, which in the end brought them the inheritance of the Duchy of Burgundy, the most affluent of all 15th century European states, and one including much of the Netherlands. Other inheritances and marriages would add Hungary and Bohemia to their possessions. For the first time since the 13th century, it seems possible that an effective political unity might be imposed on Germany and Central Europe. Habsburg family interest in uniting the scattered dynastic territories now had a possible instrument in the imperial dignity. By that time, the empire had virtually ceased to matter south of the Alps. The struggle to preserve it there had long been tangled with Italian politics. The contestants in feuds which tormented Italian cities called themselves Guelph and Ghibelline long after those names ceased to mean, as they formerly did, allegiance respectively to Pope or Emperor. After the 14th century, there was no imperial domain in Italy, and emperors hardly went there except to be crowned with the Lombard crown. Imperial authority was delegated to vicars, who made of their vicaries units almost as independent as the electorates of Germany. Titles were given to these rulers and their vicariates, some of which lasted until the 19th century. The Duchy of Milan was one of the first, but other Italian states had different origins. Besides the Norman south, the kingdom of the two Sicilies, there were the republics, of which Venice, Genoa, and Florence were the greatest. The city republics represented the outcome of two great trends, sometimes interwoven in early Italian history: the communal movement and the rise of commercial wealth in the 10th and 11th century. In much of North Italy, general assemblies of the citizens had emerged as effective governments in many towns. They described themselves sometimes as parliamenta, or as we might say, town meetings, and represented municipal oligarchies who profited from a revival of trade beginning to be felt from 1100 onwards. In the 12th century, the Lombard cities took the field against the emperor and beat him. Thereafter, they ran their own internal affairs.